All right, are you excited to hear from our first presenter today? Let's get into it. We're going to first hear from John Lewis. He's the executive director of the Heart Valve Voice USA. He was named executive director in August of 2019, and he has an extensive background in communication, patient advocacy, alliance development, and nonprofit management. Most recently, he headed his own health communications and advocacy consultancy, and that was called Intersect Strategies. Prior to this, for 8 years, he served in senior positions with the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, where he led policy development, public affairs, and government relations. Early in his career, he was a partner in a successful boutique public relations and advertising agency, directed marketing, public relations, and investor relations for a technology startup, and was marketing leader for a global clinical research organization. Not sure what he can't do. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master of Arts in Communication. Please welcome this morning your first presenter, John Lewis.
Hello, I'm John Lewis, Executive Director of Heart Valve Voice US. Amy has asked me to talk about patient advocacy. What I'm going to share with you today is maybe a broader view than you might expect. So let's go. For our purposes, I will define advocacy as trying to influence others to adopt our point of view. We are patient advocates, so we are advocating for issues that are important to us, in particular, heart valve patients. So going back a little to my training as a journalist, let's discuss the who, what, why, and how. Regarding the who, some likely suspects to advocate to might be the FDA, CMS or Medicare, private insurers, maybe Congress. And then some less likely might be researchers or medical societies or potentially even manufacturers. So let me provide a few recent real-life examples of our advocacy efforts. With the FDA, we weighed in on how patients should be engaged in the medical device development process. This is much farther along with drugs than devices. The FDA was looking for input, and we were happy to provide comments. In this case, we also arranged a webinar with the FDA so patients and other advocacy organizations could understand what the agency was looking for and the best method to make their views known. You also may want to advocate to the FDA on issues like clinical trial design or getting new products approved more quickly so patients can access them. And as the agency moves into more digital health, like EKGs on your phone and remote monitoring, the patient perspective will be very important. Then, once a product is approved for use, the question becomes, who is going to pay for it? As many heart valve patients are over 65, this is most often Medicare, so you would want to advocate to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. I won't go into all the technical details, but CMS needs to make coverage decisions on new heart valve treatments, like, for instance, covering TAVR for low-risk patients or mitral valve repair, like the new MitraClip device. As patient advocates, we not only want CMS to pay for these treatments, but we want their rules around payment to be reasonable and to ensure there is enough access to these new devices so patients don't have to travel too far or have too burdensome of a process with multiple doctor visits, for instance. This is why patient advocacy groups like Heart Valve Voice US exist. We can bring in the technical expertise, the latest research, the regulatory rules, the understanding of the process, and bring the patient voice and perspective to influence these decisions. There are differences between how patient advocacy groups may approach an issue and how an individual patient may choose to make their voice known. One important note here, also relevant to CMS, is in the last days of the Trump administration, CMS issued a rule called Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, or MCIT. This would enable automatic Medicare coverage for breakthrough devices, and breakthrough is a technical term. It's a pathway through the FDA for approval. So when the manufacturer may request that to meet market conditions. This is a huge win for patients and hopefully something we can build on as a standard practice moving forward. As patient advocates, we believe that if the FDA determines a product is safe and effective, which is their standard for approval, then Medicare should pay for it within reason. Medicare may use the term reasonable and necessary, which is different than safe and effective. And these differences are why we need patient advocates and advocacy groups to work through all of these technical regulatory issues so we can make sure devices and drugs are approved in a timely manner and then paid for through Medicare. Now, when it comes to influencing private payers, it's a whole other deal. There's generally no open, transparent process for receiving input from patients or, for that matter, medical professionals. So if you're insured through Aetna or United Health or one of the Blues, you may be confused by what they choose to cover and what they don't. If you're like me, you may even get conflicting information depending on who you talk to or the day of the week. We're dealing now with a situation with Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, one of the largest insurers in the country with 42 million customers in 13 states. Anthem is not only is the only major private insurer that does not cover low-risk TAVR and some other transcatheter heart procedures. This often drives patients into open heart surgery when TAVR would be a choice and also medically preferable. This is wrong in any environment, but when we are in the midst of a COVID pandemic, it really doesn't make sense to steer patients into a more invasive procedure that requires a longer hospital stay when TAVR is being done in some cases, many cases, on an outpatient basis. So, in this case, we've undertaken a mini social media campaign to try to shame Anthem into changing their coverage policy. So it's very difficult to shame a health insurance company, as many of you may know, unfortunately. And we've sent a letter to the CEO stressing the need for shared decision-making and patient access to a variety of therapy options. We'll keep you posted about how successful we are in this endeavor. Maybe by the time you see this, the issue will have been resolved in the best interest of patients. If not, we may ask you for help if they do not reverse their decision in the coming weeks. I want to take a bit of a detour now and talk about a different kind of advocacy, research advocacy. At Heart Valve Voice US, we've actually put together a training program funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, for patients and care partners who want to be research advocates or advisors. Why is this important? What does it entail? Well, the old research paradigm was basically researchers know what's best and they should be left alone in their labs to do this very important work. But over the past 10 years or so, with the help of PCORI, and I actually lobbied for the creation of PCORI back in 2010, that's another story entirely, there's been a movement to engage patients in research, to ask them what matters to you. There are pure clinical outcomes in research, of course, lowering your cholesterol number, improving blood pressure, fixing heart rhythm, stopping the heart valve from leaking, shrinking a tumor. But how about measuring outcomes like, I want to play with my grandkids. I want to be able to walk to the bus stop. I'd like to get back to work more quickly. I'd really like to play a round of golf. I'd like to live long enough to attend my daughter's wedding. These are some examples of what we mean by patient-centered outcomes. What is important to you, and how can those be incorporated into the research process? Another aspect of research advocacy is around clinical trials. To learn if a clinical trial is designed in a way that would make you want to participate or send you away. How many visits might be required to the research site, like a hospital? How many blood draws or images would need to be taken? Would childcare be provided, or transportation? These are factors that we know affect participation in clinical trials. What can be done to make the process more friendly for participants? Because if there is no research, then no new drugs or devices come to the market. So we need more patients in clinical trials. What does advocacy mean here? Well, you may participate in patient preference surveys. You can make your opinions known through focus groups. You can serve on advisory panels for research projects and advise on how trials can be conducted and what outcomes should be included. What burden and inconvenience patients may be willing to accept. We'd love to have you in our training, so please reach out to me if you're interested. It's free, it's all online, and you can move at your own pace. I want to mention one other area of non-traditional advocacy specific to COVID-19. As you are all aware, when the pandemic hit, the medical societies like the American Cardiology, state medical boards, government agencies, hospital systems, they were all scrambling to provide guidelines on how to safely treat patients. There are a few problems with this approach. First, in almost no cases were patients consulted. These guidances were drafted without any patient input. Second, they were confusing and sometimes contradictory. How could a patient know what they were supposed to do, what procedures to follow in the hospital? We tried to summarize these guidances so our patient community could safely navigate through their care. Finally, in many cases, heart valve repairs or replacements were deemed elective procedures. We disagree with that characterization. So we would encourage you to add your voice to these issues. In fairness, we are dealing with an unprecedented situation, but that doesn't mean the patient voice can be ignored. Getting back to some more traditional advocacy, you might be thinking, well, what about Congress, or even in some cases, state legislators? Here's what I can share. I've worked as a Washington lobbyist, a hired gun. Despite the reputation, I can tell you most lobbyists are there to educate members of Congress and, usually more importantly, their staffs about issues. For us, it may be requesting additional funding for the FDA, so they have the tools and resources to approve medical products more quickly. It's good for patients. It may be lobbying for a bigger budget for the National Institutes of Health. We are, of course, focused on the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which, for your information, now also covers sleep disorders. We may want expanded Medicare coverage for new screening or diagnostic tests. Whatever the policy being discussed, I can tell you that as a patient, especially if you are a constituent of that representative, you will have much more influence than any DC lobbyist. I have seen this in action. You tell your story, how a piece of legislation will affect you and your family. That is the most effective form of advocacy. The important thing to remember is rehearse your pitch. Tell your story clearly and concisely. A little emotion is fine. And don't forget your ask. What action do you want your political official to take? Please vote for HR 2345. Capstone of our research advocate training that I mentioned earlier is focused on helping you tell your story in any environment. So we've addressed some of the who's, what's, and whys, but before we get to the how's, the really fun part, I want to make a couple of important points. As a patient advocacy organization, we need to balance many, sometimes competing interests. At one level, we receive funding from a variety of sources, including industry. This leads some to criticize patient groups as being captive of their funders. We must fight this perception. The reality is, in my experience, much more often than not, what is best for patients is also best for industry and for our medical professionals, though we won't always agree. We have common goals of wanting patients to have the broadest access to the treatment or procedure that is most beneficial for them, and these are shared decisions between the patient and their doctors. And we want these procedures to be covered by the respective payers. The difference is, as a patient advocate, I really don't care what hospital you go to, what procedure you get, or what company manufactures your heart valve. I just want to do all I can to make sure you have access to the treatment you need and make an informed choice working with your heart team. So I want to address a few specific advocacy tactics. You have direct channels like visiting your elected officials, writing letters, making phone calls, testifying at open meetings and hearings. But much more so these days, especially with our travel being limited, we have other methods to influence. Social media is a very effective advocacy tool. Facebook, to some extent, but really Twitter is the way to get attention for your cause or your issue. So I encourage you to engage on Twitter. You can follow people without tweeting. It's free. There's some great cardiologists and heart surgeons and public health people on there, as well as policymakers and other influencers. You really can educate yourself and expose yourself to a wide variety of viewpoints, especially if you're focused in the health segment. There's other advocacy tools we're looking at too, like online petitions. We can also organize and all come together in real grassroots efforts, a term you've probably heard. We hope to someday be able to activate our patient community for grassroots advocacy. That could be a whole other presentation about how that works. I want to make one final point. The most important type of advocacy is to advocate for yourself. No one is a better advocate for your cause, for your health, than you are. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions and staying in touch. You can reach me at john@heartvalvevoice-us.org. Thank you.